Miyazaki made Howl's Moving Castle, for example, with an explicitly anti-Iraq war message. He was very much with Nausicaa, the idea that the female heroic myth should be as a peace bringer to settle conflict rather than to battle it until it finds its conclusion, like with the male call to adventure. But with Takahata, he explicitly said about Grave of the Fireflies that he never intended it to be an anti-war film, which seemed baffling to me. And he said it was to drive compassion for the post-war generation and war orphans, but not to necessarily speak out against the war.
Well, he made the point that when you depict extreme suffering and wartime, even of civilians, yes, it does undermine the glory of war, but you could very well, if you were militaristically minded, watch that and say, and then this justifies us getting revenge. And that's, for example, what a lot of the Chinese historiography of the Second World War is about. For example, they collect Japanese atrocities from all over the country, put them in Nanjing, and then turn the Nanjing massacre into a monument to the entirety of the atrocities of the Sino-Japanese War. Right. They don't care about accurate historiography. Maybe that picture of a bayoneted baby wasn't from Nanjing. They don't care. It's all about creating the myth, which then justifies militarism and anti-Japanese xenophobia. So I think Takahata makes the point well that merely showing the atrocities, even in the very delicate way that I think he achieves in this film, is not necessarily enough to just qualify as an anti-war film.
Well, I think the framing device of the film does make you consider the contexts which put Setsuko and Seita in this tragic situation more than their actual suffering. Because, of course, it's framed, fun enough, very much like the short story. It's nearly a one-to-one adaptation with a minor few divergences, which we might discuss in a moment because it makes some interesting reading. But when you front-load it with the exact moment of death of the narrator, and he's looking retrospectively on his life, and you know that, Setsuko, she is dead along with her brother, and you obviously don't find out till the end that it's her bones and ashes in the sweet can. But knowing that they're going to die at some point means that you're constantly looking for not only when the death is coming, but for the causes. And so you're microanalyzing. Okay, here's the causal effects of the firebombing displaces them from their home. Their mother dies. They go to live with their aunt. The aunt mistreats them. There is the moment of contention there whether or not Seita should have taken them from home, which I'm sure we'll discuss momentarily. And then you're on a slow countdown to their death. And instead of thinking this is a domestic tragedy, you're looking for all the people and institutions which have failed them along the way. And so it does become a thing of collective political and social responsibility. And so I do think it becomes very much a very powerful anti-war film, even if he didn't intend it, just in the way the story's told, the structure. Because it's not that the conclusion's a surprise, it's inevitable. But instead you're looking for the reason why we're going to reach this inevitable goal, and just saddened that you couldn't avoid this tragic inevitability.
Absolutely. It's, I think the theme which is Takahata wanted to convey, which comes across more strongly perhaps of the ones he wanted to convey, is the idea of the individual being helpless without society. And so we see, for example, Seita being reduced to stealing food. Theft is obviously a massive taboo in Japan. And so it's sort of to show that he's being reduced almost to an animal, that he's lost his pride and so on and so forth, even though it was out of pride that he left his aunt's house. And in interviews, he's spoken about the selfishness of younger generations of Japanese people, how they don't appreciate that so much. They think that, they can get by on their own if they have enough money because you can buy anything with money. Well, obviously, when there's a famine, like as there was in this time period because of war and displacement and so on, you can't buy food if there isn't any food to buy. You need to have the social connections. You need to know the farmers or have those close-knit social connections in order to survive, because otherwise you just won't.
Yeah. So rather than burying the lead, where do you line up on the question of, I know Takahata, you said to me, he's actually blamed Seita for Setsuko's death, saying he shouldn't have left his aunt's house. He should basically have put up with the system. I wanted to ask you directly, because when you said in Contemplations, you said the Japanese are very path-focused. When you look at Jeet Kune Do or Judo, it's the do, as in the way. Is his straying from the do the path? Does that make him morally culpable for his sister's death, as uncomfortable as it is to ask?
I don't know. I don't think Seita is on a path at all. So he is, and that's because all of the paths have been destroyed by firebombing.
Yeah.
And so I think it's perhaps a little difficult to see what path he should have taken. It's not as if there is the path there and then he's being, petulant, spoiled, or otherwise a bad person and abandoning it. I don't think that comes across at all, really. I fully understand, and I think Japanese audiences understood as well. You see, if you put yourself in that position where he's allowing his aunt to mistreat him simply because he's so totally dependent on her, then he's subjecting himself to a kind of slavery there. And I think there is a strong instinctive revulsion towards that kind of behaviour.
It's definitely instinctive, and that's why I don't personally blame him. But then you can, I suppose, if you steelman the oppositional position, you're meant to suppress your pride purely because obviously your 4-year-old sister's not a rational animal.
Well,
either.
that's the thing. That's supposed to be the difference there, isn't it? It's that he's not acting for himself. He's got Setsuko to look after. So you could make the argument that he should put up with it for Setsuko, and I think that's a much stronger argument. If Setsuko weren't there, his decisions make a lot more sense.
Yeah, and I actually think there's a bit in the novel that I picked out that wasn't in the film, but it makes the aunt a bit more of a complex character. So I'll just read this little bit. After a while, even with the rice porridge served 3 times a day, she would, with a vigorous stroke, scoop down to the bottom, giving the rice settled there to her daughter, pouring into Seita's and Setsuko's bowl only the soup with the vegetable leaves floating on the top. At times, perhaps in a pang of conscience, she would say, "My young lady here is in service as a labourer for our country. She has to eat a lot so we can have her at full strength." It's the pang of conscience bit that the original author, which I suppose we'll talk about in a bit, says there that it doesn't come across in the film, because in the film it seems that she's just quite cruel, whereas in here she almost has a self-awareness of that she's got an internal moral sensibility that says, I know I'm starving these kids, but with the state Shinto indoctrination, it's for the good of the country.
You work for our country's defense too, young lady. Eat up and work as hard as you can.
Well, the one thing which comes across quite a lot in Japanese cinema of the post-war era, so Yasujiro Ozu, for example, Tokyo Story, is you have characters who are using the social norms to justify the most incredibly selfish and self-serving desires.
It's almost like the postmodern critique of everyone's philosophy actually services their own ambition.
Well, in this case, that's true, but she's a villain, basically. Yes. And so the idea is that there are always going to be these evil people around who, okay, yes, they're clinging to these ideas of patriotism and fighting the great struggle against the enemy and so on. But then when you look at their minute actions, they're behaving in an incredibly selfish way. They're literally starving her relatives so that her daughter can get a bit more rice and so on.
That's fascinating you actually said that, because when we spoke about Miyazaki in the first podcast, there was a quote from him where he said, I find the villains more interesting because they work harder than the heroes.
Right.
Whereas with him being an anti-Miyazaki, in Takahata's stories, the villains themselves seem to indulge in capriciousness and have this post hoc rationalization.
But I think it's the kind of tragedy that we can understand. We can understand the aunt's point of view. You know, she's worried her daughter will be malnourished or starved. She's worried there's not enough food to go around. You know, and so she is probably quite conflicted, and she has this pang of conscience in the novel, as you say. It's a terrible story.
I mean, I think the man that speaking of terrible stories, the man that Seita is based off of had his own pang of conscience. Because for those who don't know, this is actually semi-autobiographical, which makes it all the more tear-jerking. Because when you watch this, look, I'm a cold-hearted bastard, but it's
one of the most moving films.
I've watched this 3 times. It's got me every single time. If I may be so bold, my only critique is that the Setsuko's death is a bit sharp because it is just with one line. You don't actually see it. But of course, it was always going to be an inevitability anyway, and it's more about the sadness of the build-up and how Seita deals with it. But actually, The Independent had a really interesting obituary on the guy who wrote it when he died a few years ago, because there's not much we know about his life, particularly in the period where after his sister had died in real life and where he writes his first novel. Because, of course, we know that Seita dies September 22nd, 1945 in the train station of malnutrition. We don't actually know how he came from being a war orphan whose sister had died of malnutrition to becoming a writer. But there is some interesting bits here. So he did survive the firebombing in Japan. Grave of the Fireflies was strongly autobiographical. And Nosaka continued to reflect on his wartime experiences in a series of writings that recalled witnessing burnt-out corpses and seeing many, including his infant sister, die of starvation. Over the years, it emerged that Grave of the Fireflies was only a first attempt at recovering a suppressed memory. When the war came to Japan, Nosaka, too old to be evacuated and too young to be conscripted, became part of the cohort charged with air raid defense. When Kobe was firebombed in June 1945, his adopted father was killed and his mother badly injured. Nosaka ran away with his infant sister, but unlike in the anime, he and the adults around him failed to care adequately for her, and she died in August 1945. He subsequently moved to Tokyo, where he was caught stealing, and was left exposed to the elements in a juvenile detention centre, where he witnessed many of his fellow inmates die of starvation, hence the kids in the train station. Finally, his natural father, by now a local councillor, was contacted and reclaimed him. So he was actually rescued.
Wow.
But he has some sort of survivor's guilt from not only his peers dying in the juvenile detention centre, but for his role in trying to take care of his infant sister and her passing away anyway. And so the burning and death of his mother, the death of his adopted father, and the death of his sister weighed so heavily on his conscience that he made this incredible story. And the translation is poorly formatted because it's the version that I did is linked in the description. But God, is it harrowing to read, and it's nearly a one-to-one adaptation. And he actually said something Carl pointed out when he's talking about Prey of all things, the new Predator film. He said there's a frustration with modern movies, and that is that no actor has truly seen proper hardship.
Yeah.
They are all soft-faced. You can't really believe them as these, Native Americans who have a mythical perspective about the world and who have seen true privation, true hardship, lived off the land. Yeah. Whereas the writer here said, I've rejected so many live-action Grave of the Fireflies creations. I believe there is one that actually got made fairly recently, but I haven't seen it. But it wasn't until the animators approached me that I decided to greenlight it and bankroll it myself. And he said, there is no way a child of this post-war generation, 40 years on, could convincingly portray the horror at seeing all your classmates and family members burned to death and your homes bombed out. But in animation, it realised it almost to the level of I remember it being. Wow. And I think not only is it a great historical piece, but it is such a sort of flashpoint example of just how great this medium can be. And that's why I think actually it's, despite my enjoyment of Howl's Moving Castle, it's probably the best Ghibli film overall. And as you said, Takahata is woefully underestimated in that regard, because I think he's just made something incredible here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also, I think, his most technically accomplished film in terms of you watch it and it feels like the best of Ghibli. Usually when you watch a Takahata film, it's not quite as polished as a Miyazaki film, or it might be significantly less polished, like Yamada's or at times Kaguya. But it's on every level a masterpiece, and you should definitely watch it.
It just frustrates me that because it was paired with Totoro, that all the merch flooded it out, because of course sometimes they mixed up the order, but people came out having seen Fireflies and then Totoro, and people came out humming Totoro and buying the cat bus, and it's like, it's gained a cult following in recent years, but it was overlooked for so long, and it's quite sad actually.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I have heard that the book is mandatory reading for a lot of Japanese schools, for example. So
I can see why. It's incredible. Some interesting observations I actually made when looking at Totoro. If you look at the posters for Totoro and Fireflies, they're almost inverted in their themes. So the original Totoro poster is it's Mei and who's her sister's name? Satsuke? Is that how you'd pronounce it? She's standing with the umbrella at the bus stop, and Mei isn't by her side. And there's this looming Totoro figure that's grinning next to her in the dark. Whereas Grave of the Fireflies, the siblings are holding the fireflies and they look overjoyed. And if you hadn't read the book, which wasn't as popularized at the time as it is now, you wouldn't know about it. But, and this is so clever for a thing from the 80s, if you use a modern saturation tool to increase the saturation on the posters, the fireflies are the lights of B-29 bombers.
Wow.
Yeah. This was 40, I just can't figure out who thought to do that, but it's fantastic. And also then it adds that weird dark dimension to Totoro, because we were talking about before how in Totoro, when they grow the tree, it turns into a mushroom cloud, and it's reclaiming the memory of the atom bomb in the minds of the Japanese for nature. But of course, it's set in the 50s. It's set in this fictional time period where the countryside wasn't depleted, where kids could have lived with bounty and plenty, whereas the actual realities were of Grave of the Fireflies. There were tons of war orphans. I mean, there's an article linked in the further reading, which is the first-hand accounts of them. And I said to you a few minutes ago, off air, in researching this podcast, I've seen more images of dead children than I'd ever care to want to look at again.
Yeah.
And So the idea that Totoro is almost like this strange utopian fantasy which never really existed, whereas Firefly is the true history, it's never often told, it's just painful.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.